Welcome to another edition of I Am AAPC. Today I have with me former National Advisory Board member, AAPC National Advisory Board member Jennifer Lavoie. How are you, Jennifer?
Doing well today. How are you, Alex?
I'm great. Thanks so much for meeting with me. And you know the journey I'm on to find nurses who found their way into the revenue cycle and medical coding and that path. So we want to hear your story a little bit, but we've known each other for a while as you served on the National Advisory Board. How's it been since your retirement from that position?
Well, I'm still keeping busy, of course, but had such great experiences on the National Advisory Board. I think of it very fondly. And, now I'm moving into the, individual members that are, new to the field. They just got that certification or they're working on the certification right now, and helping with a lot of resumes, career ladders. Also the group that's looking for a promotion. What are some different things you can do with a coding certificate? So I'm getting into a new space, but loving to serve the local members. Mm-hmm.
I love it. I love it. Well, let's hear a little bit about your journey. You started out in
Mm-hmm.
clinical care, from what I understand. Will you
Mm-hmm.
share a little bit about
Yep.
this for us?
Yeah, yeah. I right out of high school, I got a degree in corporate communications, and then when I was in my 30s, I decided to go back to school to be a nurse. I wanted to be a hospice nurse, and so went and did a 2-year nursing program, and got out. The agency that I had volunteered for as a hospice volunteer didn't have any openings. They didn't have openings very often. I knew that was a possibility, so I actually worked for a pharmaceutical company in it was a plasma procurement center where people would donate their plasma, and then they would use that to manufacture medications and vaccinations, that type of thing. And so there I was as a nurse working in a new environment with plasma donors, and talk about great adventures. When the alarm went off that the freezer temperature was around, we jumped. It wasn't code blue, it was freezer temperature. Also, just did a lot of donor relations with health screenings, making sure that they were appropriate donors. And from there, kind of got into the quality side of things, the FDA audits that space. And so really got into the regulations, the quality monitoring, the documentation. Did some switching from paper to, like a computer EHR software. And so I really liked that part of it. And then one day I, reached out to the lady I had kind of kept in touch with at hospice because I was still a volunteer. And I said, I am still waiting for that job, And in the meantime, too, I had worked part-time at a nursing home, on Saturday nights just to get a little bit more experience because I was still in that first couple of years of being a nurse. And so she said, oh, so-and-so is going to retire. We're going to have a retirement party, and such a date. And, so let's get you in for an interview tomorrow. Oh, great. So, went to work for hospice and just loved it. Absolutely loved that work. That was what I had felt was a mission and a calling that I had wanted to pursue. And it was just that great. It was just that great. So after several years of doing that, my children were still young. I found that, the on-call schedule was a little hard, and I was literally looking for where is the job where I don't have to be on call or working holidays. Right. I wanted to be home with my kids for those holidays, the weekends, the special occasions, because I found I was missing that with my nursing schedule. And so really, really took a hard look, how do you take that career you love and then the family you love even more and make it all work together. And so in that health system where they had the hospice organization, they had an opening for a nurse auditor in the HIM department. I didn't really know what an HIM department was. I didn't really understand what a nurse auditor did. I saw Monday through Friday, 8 to 4:30.
That schedule.
That's all I. And so I, tossed in my resume, and, they saw that I had auditing experience back at the pharmaceutical company. I had pulled in some kind of auditing things that I had done in other jobs prior to being a nurse. And so I went in with, I have a track record of auditing in multiple industries. And I think I could learn the rules of your world and audit, I didn't even know what I was getting into. In all honesty, they hired me. And it was life-changing. And I remember thinking, and I've told this story many times, so they put me down in the coder room, basement of the hospital, and I'm sitting there with these coders. It was a Friday. On Friday, I was a nurse. On Monday, I was sitting in a room with coders. And I remember about like Wednesday, I turned around and went, I had no idea that all of you were in this basement, that you knew so much, that you were involved in every patient chart at that time. And I was just amazed at what they were doing. I was fascinated. They trained me. They trained me in the art of connecting clinical care, documentation, and codes. I remember them, opening up a code book, an AAPC code book. And, this is how you read the codes, and this is how you look for a code. Don't forget to read this stuff at the bottom and these little notes. And if there's a paragraph, read that too. Don't just read the code. They taught me how to do this, right? And over the course of several years, we had interesting things in the operating room, interesting new stuff in the cath lab, supplies, devices, drugs, pharmacy, it was just one thing after another. And so, and every time there was something new clinically, they would get me involved because I was the nurse. And I'm like, yeah, but I've never worked in a cath lab. They're like, that's okay. You're all we've got. There's just one of me. And so those coders did a great job of training me. And with that, one day at lunch, they were explaining to me how there's, two different ways to get certified in the coding world, right? And that I should really think about that. One of them, you have to go to school for, a couple semesters, probably at a community college, and the other one you can take online classes. And that was really early in the online classes thing, and I was a little bit intrigued. I was intrigued by that. But the online classes sound like they worked a lot easier with my schedule because, I'm a mom, right? And I had just gone to school to be a nurse for a couple of years. I wasn't going to stop life and go do that again. And so AAPC was the easy answer. That was the easy answer. And they talked to the director, and she said, oh, sure, we'll even pay for it here. This makes a lot of sense, And so, long story short, I took the online class, had to buy an extension. I was working hard to get that done while I was still working full time, and passed the test. And so I think it's one of those things that the CPC certification, I'll say it found me. I didn't find it, right? I felt very much led to it. Those coders that I was working with, they got me and my career pointed in a good trajectory. And what a nice thing to do for somebody, right? And I didn't even understand where they were going, but they thought that, hey, if you had this, you'd be really handy. And as I was learning the coding, it just all made sense with what we were seeing in real life, hospital activities. So found it to be very helpful. And then along the way, I got into the revenue integrity space because, at some point, revenue integrity was kind of invented later after, the coding and billing and the traditional parts of revenue cycle. And so I ended up in revenue integrity space doing the same thing I was doing in HIM, but just on a larger scale. And then have been in that area at multiple hospitals. And then I also worked for 2 software companies where just kind of pulled in that how do we connect the clinical care with the documentation, the codes, the charge master, which has a lot of codes in it, CPT codes and HCPCS codes usually. And so, yeah, it's been a fantastic journey. And I say over and over again, just leaping over the fence and getting that CPC did a lot for my career. It changed the trajectory. Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating. Wow. And I'm learning this from the nurses I've spoken with. It has, for many of them, the career has fallen into their lap. They didn't know much about it, just like yourself. But I'm curious, did having your nursing background, what kind of advantage did it give you in the coding side? Because you spoke about they needed a nurse, and even though you didn't understand every nuance of the clinical pieces, they needed you. But were there other ways that having that clinical background was a help?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you think about clinical documentation, right? Reading a physician note or a nurse's note or respiratory therapist, physical therapist, whatever it may be, when you're reading this note, using nursing knowledge, even if it's just from textbook, even if I hadn't worked in that space of clinical care, right, I would be able to picture it. So if you think about a cath lab note or an operating room note, right, where they're describing what they're doing for that patient, I would be able to picture it. Sometimes I would draw it out for a coder. I would say, oh, here's the heart, right? Here's the heart, and they're going here. Oh, that's the code. Oh, I didn't realize. Oh, you know what I mean? And so essentially just kind of taking that clinical care and using the nursing knowledge to get to the code. A lot of what came in really handy for me, which kind of ended up being my niche space, was taking supplies, devices, and implants and doing the HCPCS codes, right? There's a lot of organizations that struggle with that just don't have that connection. And when you have the connection and you're getting those HCPCS codes done correctly with the right units for drugs, supplies, implants, it can be millions of dollars of difference, like a really huge ROI, return on investment. And so with that said, being able to understand what, because a lot of times the HCPCS code will say something very generic like mesh or joint device. And so being able, like a joint device has 5 parts usually, sometimes 7. And so being able to go, oh, a stem is part of a joint device. A lot of the coders that I run into didn't know that. I didn't know what those were. Being able to go to a manufacturer's website, see what an implant is, what it's used for, and then being able to translate that into the code. Just being able to understand what kind of surgery it is, and a cath lab procedure, EP lab, IR, that type of thing, helps to understand how to code those supplies, devices, implants. Then when you look at drugs, right? A lot of the drug codes are very specific with strength, with, even dosages, like they're going to charge it per milliliter or per milligram, and the charges, you can charge quantity 1 per milligram. If you give a 50 milligram dose, that's quantity 50 on a bill instead of 1 dose, it's quantity 50 for the milligrams. And so just understanding, and again, I remember, taking pharmacology in nursing school. They don't teach pharmacology in coding school. They teach it in nursing school though, and understanding to do those drug calculations for when I'm providing safe patient care. Now I take that knowledge and use it for how to do drug calculations for charging. and it can make millions of dollars of difference for a health system.
Wow. Earlier, when we were speaking, you talked about how when you went into that basement of the facility and first were interacting with those coders and how they were teaching you, but it sounds like you were teaching them as well.
I found my niche. They led me to it, right? Literally to the spot of like, I remember one of the coders one day, she was very seasoned. I learned so much from her. one of those great mentors and advocate for doing the right thing kind of people that you meet in your career. So, but anyway, she said, Jen, we got a problem with observation billing. It's a GO 378 versus a GO 379, and there's some money tied to it, and we got to figure this out. Can you take a look at it, right? And it was a matter of, she had taught me how to look up regulations. That was a blessing. Got to know how to look up regulations, CMS.gov. Looked up regulations, looked up the code rules, looked at that HCPCS book, right? You know what I mean? And kind of put all the pieces of the business together, right? And understand, I remember even finding a webinar or two out there on the AAPC website of this. Going to the boss, like, hey, we're trying to figure this out, and there's a webinar out there that we just, just for this much money, we could make this much money. She bought it, that was good. But yeah, just how do you use the tools in the toolbox, right? Put it all together to create a solution and a result for your health system. And so they would give me little projects like that. We call them our revenue generating projects. They ended up, in finance, they called them incremental revenue projects because we were making new money to the tune of millions by just using codes correctly and making sure that the clinical reality was correctly identified on codes on claims. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Well,
okay.
Thinking about your role as a clinician, especially you had a strong desire to work in the hospice space, which is not for everybody. A lot of hard things are in that space, but you have a strong desire to help people through those tough times. What was it like making that switch from caring for people at such a high level to you're in the basement of the facility working on codes and the revenue cycle?
Yeah, it's interesting you ask that, because as I've hired nurse auditors over the course of years, we usually have this conversation really early on. Like you're used to being in someone's space, doing things with your hands to take care of them, right? And now all of a sudden you're at a computer and you're looking at their documentation, you're looking at their bill, maybe you're looking at their, different pieces of that. I always tell people, like, part of holistic nursing care is to provide our patient with good quality care, but also to provide our patient with a fair and accurate bill. And the way that we provide our patient with a fair and accurate bill is to have appropriate codes, appropriately applied together, right, with all the edits and modifiers and, regulations and everything in between, all those different pieces of the business. When we as nurses or coders can provide our patient with a fair and accurate bill, that's good care. And if you can take it one step further in your career, take all of that and then go fix something in a health system, right, where that implant is properly charging and coded every time. I mean, let me tell you, when an implant isn't charged or coded correctly, most likely the documentation of the serial number, the lot number, all those stuff that could possibly get recalled later, most likely that's not in there right either. So that's a patient safety issue that as a nurse, we can take care of that from behind the scenes. And so I think that fair and accurate bill for patients is a part of holistic nursing care. And so it's a different way to be a nurse.
Yes, you're still caring for them, just not in a visible way that the clinician does.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, I want to jump to your AAPC exam and the preparation. You mentioned that you had to have an extension to give you more time to prepare, which is not uncommon. And if you don't have a clear path in front of you, you had a family to take care of, so you're trying to squeak in study time, I'm sure. What was that preparation like? You had a little bit of experience. working in the field before taking the
Mhm.
course and the exam, so that probably helped prepare you. But
Mhm.
what was that like? Was it completely foreign when you jumped into it?
Yeah, it was the first like online class or online curriculum I'd ever done, and so it was the balance between reading the textbook because I'm a textbook reader, so reading that book that came with it, and I actually went and bought a paper copy of the book. I know that they have the ebooks, but I'm like, too much screen all day long. I'd rather have the book. So I actually ordered the book, got that, was reading it. I remember that. And then they had the online modules. Now, what I found after I, discovered I was running out of time is that I needed to take a calendar and I needed to put a line in the sand, right? Like, I'm going to sign up for that exam on this date. And then I took the calendar and literally wrote which modules I needed to get done every week. And and I gave myself, like, I had to pace myself. It's Saturday night at midnight. You're not done with that module. You need to kick it up a little bit, right? Because you got to stay on track and get yourself to that test, or you're going to have to buy another extension. And so I literally mapped it out on a calendar to really keep myself paced. So that, and it's the old saying, like, you can't eat the elephant all at one time. You get one bite at a time, right? So I literally mapped it out so that, by middle of each week, I had to meet this milestone. By the end of this week, I had to meet the final milestone. And so I had it broken down with the modules, the chapters, that type of thing in the week. There were some that took me a little longer than I was expecting. So there I was Friday night after the kids went to bed. Saturday, like Saturday night, I'm like, oh, I gotta like really sit down and buckle down and do this. Like, it was a commitment, a time commitment, but I had to find a way to pace myself because there was always competing priorities, always distractions, always something else to do, right? And so I found that to be really helpful to keep the discipline. Sometimes when you have an online test that isn't the type with the instructor, right, it feels a little bit more of a free fall. And so, but by really mapping it out, that worked for me. It might not work for everybody, but it worked for me. And then, so I was getting ready for that test. I was taking the practice test and feeling pretty good about it. One thing is, back then all the tests were on site. So I picked a testing location by date. It ended up being about an hour and a half away. And, it was the type of thing where, they wanted you there by 7:30 in the morning on a Saturday for 8 o'clock start time. I'm not a morning person. And so, like, there I am at 4 a.m., so one of my recommendations to test takers as I work with them at the local chapter is to say, like, be honest with yourself of, are you a night person? Are you a morning person? When are you at your prime? And schedule your test, because nowadays, you don't have to drive an hour and a half. You can do it online. And do it in your prime time. Don't try to fight your circadian rhythm and be a morning person when you're not. So that's one of the recommendations I have to test takers. But and I was a night nurse. When I was running hospice, I was working evenings and nights quite often. So I'm very good at that time. So doing that, the test took several hours. I thought it was great. I remember they let you have snacks and a little water bottle, and I just got through it. It was one of those things where good old-fashioned test taking skills. I remember when I was in nursing school, and they talked about just test taking strategies, right? Like, go through and do the questions, like, then understand what you're good at and what you're challenged at. Now, I can say, as a nurse in nursing school, one of my not strongest areas was cardiac cath lab, all that cardiology, right? I was great with burns. I was great with other intensive care stuff, right? No problem on respiratory, great with kidneys. cardiology. So I went through that AAPC test, and in all honesty, my strengths as a nurse were also my strengths with coding. I don't know what that is. I talked to a couple other nurses that have taken the coding test. I'm like, yeah, me too. So, kind of know where you were strong back in nursing school. You might see some correlations in the coding program. But with that said, I went through and I was like, ooh, all that cardiac stuff, I'm going to do that last, right? I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it last because I'm going to do what I'm strong at first. Couple reasons for that is because, number one, you might know the material a little better. And number two, you're going to feel better. You think about the emotions that go through our head while we're taking a test. If you go, ooh, I knew that one, got it. Ooh, I knew that one, I got it, right? That builds our self-confidence, kind of keeps us going during the test. Whereas if right away we're looking at questions and being like, I have no clue what they want, like that is defeating, and that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so, for me, putting those cardiology ones at the end and, turned out great for me. And then, fast forward, I end up doing cardiology coding. The cath lab.
Yeah, it seems to work like that. The universe has a way of doing that.
Yeah.
Well, so did you notice that the specialties that you connected with as a nurse, because you talked about that when you took the exam, like those areas you did really well. And did you feel that connection with those specialties while you were taking your course? Did you make that connection?
Oh yeah. There was a lot of correlation, like I remember in nursing school, like, respiratory chapter just came really naturally to me. I just loved it. And, and then you get into the coding thing, like, oh, respiratory, my friend. So what do we got going with these lungs? What's the code for COPD versus pneumonia? And so, I found that correlation, that the things that had interested me, that I found to be fun and easy in nursing school, the same kind of thing. The things that were challenging in nursing school also came a challenge. And I think, for cardiology, you think about all those different parts of the heart. Just the anatomy of the heart is so complex and beautiful. But yet, when you think about all the different procedures that they're doing on the heart, there's a lot of codes. That's a big chapter, right? And very detailed on the anatomy, which blood vessel we're talking about and which area of the heart we're talking about and which valve. And so just being spot on that is really important. And so I always had to try just a little harder to focus in on those pieces and have my little diagram. I remember drawing the diagram of the heart right there on the test. I could keep track of it. It was my scratch paper. And so, because I'm a picture paints 1,000 words kind of person. So, but yeah, definitely I noticed a correlation. Other nurses that I'd had as nurse auditors, where I encouraged them to pursue either the CPC or the COC. A lot of times in the revenue integrity nurse space, we get that COC. And they say the same kind of thing. I always, found these, I had one, she was an ICU nurse, and she ended up being a dialysis nurse along the way. And she's like, oh yeah, that's just like the back of my hand. I can code that. I didn't even need to read the test, read the chapter to get there. Because it's just I already know what they're talking about with the documentation. I just have to learn the code rules. And so, I have heard that correlation many times from nurses.
Okay. Well, do you have any credentials other than your RN and your CPC? Did you expand? It seems like they can be addicting, and you find other ways to learn.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I decided, I'm one of those that I like to see the full picture. And as I decided to get into more of the software piece, where I looked at how does the software get configured to produce accurate codes, right? So if you think about, in health systems where they're turning tens of thousands of patients a day, right? We need to harness the software automation as much as we can. And so, so I had the registered nurse, I got the CPC, and then I went into more of the software world with some of the software credentials and getting the certifications in different parts of software. So that was kind of a very different world. So I didn't get any of the other certifications with the AAPC. When I was on the National Advisory Board, I had exposure to how those tests are written, how to write test questions, you know, and some of the content. So I did have exposure to that, which was a really neat experience in understanding kind of how to take industry knowledge and put it into a curriculum, I think is an art form. But yeah, as far as other certifications, I kind of went into a different direction so that I could combine all worlds, right? The world of clinical care with my RN, the world of codes using that CPC knowledge and experience, and then the world of software. Because if I can automate something so that it accurately creates the code correctly, right? Makes that coder's job easier. It's that much easier to hit that 95% OIG CMS accuracy rate, right? Rather than a coder trying to know all things and sit there and try to put a code on everything and understand it all. It's not realistic for coding success, for claims accuracy. So yeah, trying to automate as much as we could with software. Mm-hmm.
Well, it sounds like your career, even after you made the jump into coding and the revenue cycle, has taken twists and turns. And you had mentioned hiring nurses and things like that. Give us a little insight into the different roles that you've had that has led you to where we are today.
Yeah, absolutely. So from that, I'll say from that HIM experience, right, where I was the nurse auditor, I went to the revenue integrity space, and I was a nurse auditor in the revenue integrity space, doing the exact same thing, which, you know, I always tell people when I'm doing the workshops on resume writing, job finding, you know, those types of things, like, it isn't always like what you want to do, it's how you search for it, right? Like the words you use, right? So HIM department, coding, revenue integrity, billing, auditing, you know, like have those keywords, you know, right there in your search so that you can get it, because every health system can call it a little bit different name, you know. So went to do this in the revenue integrity space. And then I was promoted to be the charge capture manager, meaning that my group would make sure that the clinical care provided, and that could be services, pharmaceuticals, those supplies, implants, devices, make sure that those were captured, that those were charged and triggered correctly. That's when I got into a lot of the automation features, you know, just because that did increase our accuracy. Then from there, I went and worked for a software company, and I worked in the product division where they were doing product development, so new software. And I was the director of taxonomy and ontology. Now, taxonomy is the classification of content. We classify content with codes. So one of the product development guys, he says, "You're a natural taxonomist." And I'm like, I don't even know what he means. He meant you're naturally classifying content, right? Now, in the computer world, they use other codes sometimes, other code sets. We use CPT codes, ICD-10, CM, PCS, the HCPCS codes. If you're in revenue integrity and charging, you use the revenue codes, the UB04 revenue codes. But so we have standardized code sets. A lot of times in the software side, they're using things like SNOMED codes. But I found very quickly that I could have one piece of care, and it could have all these different codes from all these different code sets. If you think about, sometimes there can be a piece of care that it can have a CPT code or a HCPCS code, depending on payers. But in the software world, it could have a couple other codes, right? And so if I could take this content, medical software content, and put all the codes together, then the software would be able to find it. When you think about like software working really fast, right? And analytic engines. So long story short, my team classified information using codes, using CPT codes. So that was exciting. Then from there, I went and worked for a different software company, and our customers, I was on the account management team, and I led it as the customer care team, right? Our customers were hospital revenue integrity and HIM departments that used our software. So kind of went to how do we take care of our customers, make sure that they have everything they need, not only with the software, but they understand how to use it and how to create great results in their hospital. Then decided to go back to healthcare, and I thought, I'm going to take it easy after all this software. I'm going to go be a nurse auditor again. That was such a fun job. So I went and worked for a nurse auditor for a couple of years. That was great. And felt like putting on an old pair of comfortable shoes again, you know. And then a headhunter found me. And right now I'm leading, I think I got 7 teams where it is revenue integrity, HIM departments, coding departments, and so I lead all of those departments. So it's about 200 people, and it's considered middle revenue cycle, right? And we do both the facility charging and codes as well as the professional charging and codes. So yeah. So it's been an interesting journey, and I truly think about, like, again, how that CPC credential kind of changed the trajectory, got me into a completely different space. So.
Wow. And you could have never imagined when you were nursing, you're thinking hospice nurse, this is my path.
Right.
And I'm glad you had the opportunity to work in that space for a time, but it eventually didn't work with your family how you had hoped.
Mm-hmm.
And wow, just right down a new road. And what's interesting to me, Jennifer, is even when you break into the revenue cycle and coding, there are so many different paths, and you show that. And it's interesting to hear
Mm-hmm.
you working on the software side as well.
Yeah. And you know, you kind of have to take a hard look sometimes and figure out, like, what do I like? What am I interested in? You know, I remember reading something, this was like 15, 20 years ago, and it said, you know, if you figure out what you like and you're passionate about it, and then you can kind of weave that into your career, your, you know, likelihood of making a difference, right? It wasn't your likelihood of being successful, because success is kind of like everybody has their own different, you know, definition of that. But your likelihood of making a difference, having a positive impact, is so much higher if you're passionate about it. And I love software. I love providing a fair and accurate bill for a patient. That's holistic patient care. I love doing it on large scale, right? If I can do it in a software company and touch 400 customers, which are 400 health systems all at once with something I tweaked in my software, that's huge, right? That's fun. If I can do it at a health system where I can say, if we just change this one setting in the pharmacy, it's going to make $2 million next year. Oh, well, let's just change that one setting in the pharmacy, right? You know what I mean? Because again, it'll provide a fair and accurate bill that'll reduce denials for the health system and that patient, and I think that's huge. You know, there's nothing more frustrating than somebody goes gets health care when they're very vulnerable. I mean, we don't go and get health care on our best day, right? We sometimes for preventative medicine maybe, but you know, a lot of times we're seeking health care when we're having a bad day. And so you go get health care, and then a couple months later you get a wrong bill. That's not good. That's not good. And then you got to make phone calls when you're sitting on hold and you're worried about it. And, you know, even worse yet is if it isn't coded right, sometimes that can change the patient's out of pocket, which means that the patient paid too much. That's not right. So providing those fair and accurate bills to patients, I'm very passionate about that. I'm passionate about positive impacts, and I'm passionate about software and how to connect the dots. So,
I love it. I love it. As we wind down, Jennifer, would you speak to nurses who may be watching this? And I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but what
mhm.
advice might you give to a nurse who's considering this path? Of how would they explore if this would be a path for them?
Yeah, I, I would say be open to learning, right? Be open to learning because, you've got that nursing knowledge, that nursing experience, right? And when you're going to go into a new, I'll say a new nursing specialty, like let's say you were a dermatology nurse and now you're going to switch to be a pediatric nurse, completely different specialties. It would take you a year or two to become an expert at that, right? And so if you're going to switch into this, it's a completely new specialty. Give yourself some time to learn. Find really good resources, whether that be other nurse auditors that you can work with or talk to, other coders that have been in the business for a while. The AAPC resources are just fantastic. There's just a huge amount of information out there, whether it's just information on the website, information in the books. Don't be afraid to buy the book, right? The certifications, the classes, but the webinars that are going on and on, just huge. And, getting involved in that local chapter meeting. The thing I think that was such a positive with COVID is a lot of the local chapters got into these virtual presentations, right? And like, I like to present, but and all of a sudden I can present from, a chapter across the country on Monday and a different chapter across the country on Tuesday and be sitting in the same place. And so it's fantastic. And likewise, you can attend different chapter meetings from across the country, in addition to going to your in-person meetings that are local. I think it's important for a variety of learning to do, if you can get some other ones from other places, but it's also important to do your local ones for the networking, that face-to-face, so, just professional handshake skills, we call them. But I think more and more, this industry is becoming a nationwide industry, right? So it's good to have exposure to healthcare and some of those, people that are working in other areas of the United States. Like my team, I hire them from anywhere in the United States. And so like we have a lot of fun when we bring in somebody from a completely different region and we say, oh, by the way, our MAC, which is your Medicare, contractor, is different. Don't forget. Like, oh, good point. So having that exposure so that you are ready to, work in any market, not just your local market, I think is important in this industry nowadays to really open up your opportunities. But learn as much as you can, and keep in mind, this is a tough one, keep in mind that the coding world changes faster than the clinical world. Coding world is changing really fast. They're coming out with new codes on a regular basis. It used to be like evidence-based care guidelines in the clinical area. Like once in a while, we'd have something change. If you were in a really good technology area, it would be more often. But a lot of good things that you learned in nursing school, you keep using them for 10, 15 years. In the coding world, you have to be on your feet. It changes rapidly. And so you have to be open-minded to what you learned a year ago might be different today. Got to be open-minded, got to know how to look up those regulations, those code rules. Every year, when that new code book comes out, you got to get the new code book every year. You can't be using last year's code book or the year before. Got to stay current on it. So I think that's what I told a lot of my nurse auditors. And then just think about your patient and how do I make a difference for my patient in a new way, in a holistic new way, not necessarily with my hands at the bedside, but if I can do something for their bill or their codes to be more accurate, that's good care.
I love it. Thanks so much, Jennifer. And if a nurse would like to reach out to you, could they find you on LinkedIn?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, Jen Lavoie, Lavoie on LinkedIn. You betcha.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing your story, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Have a great day.
You too.